that some of you have been waiting for a long time for our keynote speech tonight. Let me introduce Mr. Kevin Lowe. Kevin Lowe is the General Manager of Google Fiber and leads Wi-Fi initiatives such as Google's partnership to provide Wi-Fi in U.S. Starbucks stores. Well, I was actually Starbucks store this afternoon and using the Wi-Fi there. Before joining Google, Kevin was the COO of M2Z Networks, a wireless service provider. He also served as the CFO and COO of Navisite, where he led the successful turnaround of the publicly traded telecom services company. Kevin was also the founder and CEO of 2 software companies, both of which were acquired in the 2000s. In his spare time, Kevin is passionate about triathlon and focusing on implementing technology on education. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's welcome Mr. Kevin Lowe.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just start by saying what an honor it is to be here tonight. My name is Kevin Lowe. I currently work at Google, where I lead our Google Fiber business. Today's theme, I guess the theme of this conference in many ways, is infrastructure for a smart world. And so on behalf of the Google Fiber team, it's such an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm actually speaking on behalf of our team. It's not just me. We have a large contingent, you guys would be happy to know, of Asian people. A lot of Chinese people work on Google Fiber. And I was joking with some of them, and they wanted me to send their best. So let me just start first by lowering your expectations. My day job is actually keeping the trains running on time. And they very rarely let me out here in public. And you'll probably figure out why as I bumble my way through this conversation. So I've been working at Google for about 4 years now. And I joined originally to help build our fiber business, our access business overall. Google Fiber, for some of you who don't know, it is an internet and TV service provider. And so in the markets that we compete in, Kansas City, Provo, Austin, and we just 2 weeks ago announced a handful of other metro areas, we compete directly with the traditional telco incumbents. And in the markets that we're in, that's Comcast, Time Warner, AT&T, Frontier, and the usual suspects that you'd see out there. So in this conversation this evening, I actually wanted to do 3 things. One, I wanted to talk a little bit about gigabit broadband access and really focus in on why does it actually matter. Number 2, I wanted to share with you an insider's view into some of the things that we've been doing at Google Fiber, maybe share with you some of the key insights and some of the learnings along the way. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the broader impact of what happens when communities are connected with high-speed broadband together. So let's start with some data and the state of the broadband market today. Less than 10% of the population worldwide subscribes to broadband services. And if you actually add in their mobile internet, that number's around 30%. So, and also in addition to that, I think some of you guys have heard some of the conversations out there in the market. There are almost 2 to 3 billion people without access to internet at all. And so I just wanted to be conscious that as we talk about speed and talking about the next generation of these networks, it's also important to keep in mind that roughly 70 to 90% of the world's population is just coming online for the very first time. Here in America, and I apologize for the small chart that we have over there, but I'll walk you through the key pieces. Here in the US, while 70% of Americans have broadband at home, the speeds are actually quite low. And this chart shows the average download speeds on a worldwide basis. And depending on whose data you look at, the US is somewhere between 14th and 38th. I think the data that we're showing here puts us at roughly 25th in the world in terms of average download speeds. The good news is that increasingly there's a recognition that this is a big problem. In fact, the White House, I want to say in the late January timeframe, maybe three weeks ago now, actually came out very publicly acknowledging the importance of broadband speeds as an anchor point for U.S. competition and competitiveness and economic growth. So the question is, why does speed matter? Now, speed matters to me, and it probably matters to you for maybe a lot of the same reasons. We upload a lot of content. We download a lot of content. When I watch Netflix, I actually don't want it to buffer. My kids, I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old at home who are obsessed with the Mars Curiosity rover. And for them, speed means that they get to go on Google Earth and walk on the surface of not just the moon, of Mars, which is an amazing application if you haven't seen it, but it does require a lot of speed. And just last night, we were touring some of the world's best museums online. These are some of the things that you can do with a gig. And so at Google Fiber, we deliver gigabit connectivity, and that's 1,000 megabits up and 1,000 megabits down. And if I went back to the prior chart, just to put that in perspective, the average American today has approximately 10 megabits a second, I think it's actually around 11 megabits a second now, of downlink speed, and uplink speeds are around 1.5. So in my household, at least, speed matters most when we don't have it. So right around 5 o'clock in every afternoon, when all of my neighbors are also getting online at the same time, we notice those connection speeds start to slow. And the practical example that I see in the last couple of weeks has been the fact that my wife has been uploading a video of an HD soccer match, and she's on hour 28 in getting that content uploaded to the cloud. So I think it's increasingly important and increasingly obvious to all of us why speed actually does matter. And speed doesn't just matter for me and you, it also matters for Google. And I get this question quite a bit. Why is Google doing this? Google's a software company. Why are you guys investing the tremendous amount of money required to go compete in a telecom business? And frankly, at that, building a brand new network from scratch. Well, Google's mission, Larry and Sergey, that's the picture of them in the garage when they started this, was to organize the world's information and make it easy and fast for people to get access to it. And that's really been our mission ever since. And you will have noticed that at Google, we've invested tremendous amount of engineering cycles in making things work faster. We built Chrome from the ground up because the browsers were incredibly slow at the time. Incredibly slow, they still are. But that's why we built Chrome. We have teams of people that spend tremendous amount of energy making search go faster. And we track these down to milliseconds, and we publish it online. But more importantly, the reason that Google is involved in access initiatives overall, and the reason that we've been building out Google Fiber, is really the following chart. It really has to do with innovation. Now, let me walk you through what this looks like. If you go back to the early 1990s, and you think about the fundamental drivers of innovation, it really starts with CPU speeds, which for all of us in the room, we were familiar with Moore's Law. We know roughly the predictability of improvement and cost side savings on an annual basis or by volume basis. Right? And that's a well-understood phenomenon, and we've been on that curve pretty regularly since, again, going back 20, 25 years now. Secondly, storage costs. I know that tomorrow storage will be cheaper than it is today, and I roughly know with what kind of degree of certainty that price point is going to be at. And storage has been a big underpinning of this. But finally, when you look at access speeds, if you go back to the year 1997 or the year 2000, access speeds have really flattened out here in the US. In 1997, when the broadband modems were launched, and by the way, a lot of us might have remembered the dial-up days, but you went from a 56K modem to broadband. That was roughly 100x improvement in speeds. And to put that in context, when we talk about going from broadband today to gigabit connectivity, that's another 100x improvement in speed. Okay? So if we go back to pre-97 and then post-1997, that was an incredible leap forward. And it drove not just all the applications that we use online today, from e-commerce to watching videos online, thinking about how maps work. But think about all the underlying technologies that actually have been built as a result of that. Everything from storage to networking gear, all the way up and down the technology stack. And again, from our standpoint, that stagnation has become a problem. It's not just at Google. We have product managers right now that have amazing products that they cannot launch because people at home don't have access speeds. I'm going to pick on one of our favorite friends and partners down the street from us, Cisco. They have this beautiful system called the telepresence system. And if you haven't used it, it's gorgeous. These are really, really high-quality video conferencing systems. They spend a lot of energy engineering the light so that everybody looks great, and it feels like you're right there. And that requires 10 megabits a second of uplink and downlink on a relatively consistent basis. Now, the sad part of the story is Cisco actually had an initiative to take that 10, compress it down to 3.5, and then make that available to consumers. And what they found after 4 years, a lot of great R&D work, was that there's no addressable market for it. So at Google, this is really the reason that we're invested in Google Fiber. It's really about moving the web forward, and we're fundamentally convinced that if we get access speeds back on the same trajectory as CPU speeds and storage, that we're going to see and unlock that next wave of innovation. There's a second reason that we're doing what we're doing, and I go back to the earlier chart about the populations that aren't online today. As we build out brand new networks, the other thing that we're really focused on is the ability to provide more ubiquitous access to people. And I think I mentioned the statistic earlier, that around 30% of US households don't have broadband at home. Now, it's not a surprise that Google doesn't take paper resumes. But I don't know if you knew this, but Walmart also doesn't take paper resumes. And 80% of Fortune 500 companies don't take paper resumes. So increasingly, the digital divide is actually, the gap will only increase as we think about how we move people forward. And that's really the second reason that we're doing what we're doing. All right. So talking about Google Fiber and what we've been doing. Why don't we have faster internet? If we all agree that it's an important thing to have, even the president is saying that broadband speeds are important for economic development and growth, we don't. And the US has a very odd dynamic. The dynamic is that there aren't that many players in any given geography. And so most people don't have a lot of options when it comes to choosing their service providers. These are two articles that I clipped out. I've had to redact their names, but these were literally articles and quotes that have been out there for the last 2.5, 3, 4 years now from other players in the marketplace telling consumers that they don't need faster speeds. I'll let you in on a little secret. One of the things that we found is that when you unleash speeds, people do a lot more. And in fact, we've been really surprised about this. When you literally raise the ceiling on what's available and you watch those usage patterns, I think people would be really surprised. And that's what gives us confidence that we're on the right side of history here in pushing innovation. So let me spend a second and tell you a little bit more about what Google Fiber does. And in particular, I actually wanted to focus on two things that you guys might find more interesting. And so I'm going to focus on one, product, and then two, I'm going to focus a little bit on our build-to-demand model. These are probably two of the bigger innovations, if you will, behind what Fiber does. So first, on the TV product itself. For those of you who don't know, the offerings that we have in the market are, we have a Gigabit internet service that's 1,000 megabits up, 1,000 megabits down. We offer that for $70 a month. And then for $130, we have a Gigabit plus TV offering. And our TV offering is really interesting, not so much in that it's differentiated primarily by the quality of the user experiences. And maybe this in many ways highlights the lack of innovation that we've seen in the market. So we built all of our own devices. We have a DVR that has 2 terabytes of storage. It records 8 programs at the same time. Frankly, if you use it all up, you're watching too much TV. The remote control that we offer is actually a tablet. That's the default experience that we built. And so when you think about designing a service for an existing remote control, but then, that's where everybody optimized. But if you actually pivot and you say, hey, listen, what if I were redesigning that experience with a tablet in mind? What would be different? Well, a lot of things are very different. The second screen experiences are very different. The reality is that most people watch TV probably with their laptops and tablets open as well. The other thing that we've been able to innovate a lot on is Wi-Fi. We spend a lot of energy on Wi-Fi. In fact, a funny stat that I got from our friends at Best Buy, where that almost half of all Wi-Fi devices that people buy at Best Buy get returned because people don't know how to get it set up properly. And they're not wrong. When you look at the my Wi-Fi is not working, I'm going to add an access point. That's actually the wrong answer, right? co-channel, you're going to add interference, etc. And so what we do is we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can design a better experience for people in the homes. I'll give you an example. There is no page that says 192.168. etc. Right? You go to access. You literally just open up your Fiverr account, and then you can get access to all the admin pages. Number two, we spend a lot of time tuning the various access points that you put in your home between 2.5 and 5 gigahertz to provide seamless experiences. We do a lot of work on power control, and how you work on handoffs. And these are all things that just software should be able to do. And I think our users actually appreciate that. Another part of our product and user experience is our focus on the user. And I think this sounds really silly, but one of the first things we decided to do up front was when we show up to your house, we actually make an appointment. And it's really funny, when I did the first call centers, hey, when do you want to be installed? Well, how about 8 o'clock? And they said, the user would say, well, you mean between 8 and 12? No, we mean at 8 o'clock, like a real person would normally do, right? Can you imagine if at work you had a meeting scheduled? Oh, I'll show up at between 8 and 12. Please sit at your desk and wait for me. So the second thing that we do is our users, our installers, carry a vacuum cleaner with them, right? So we have an opportunity to really rethink how people want to be treated by their service providers, and I think that's a really big differentiator. And so, we track this a lot. We spend a lot of time on social, and so I've just clipped out some of the tweets and some of the things that you guys will hear out there, and the buzz that we kind of track. So one thing that makes Google Fiber a little bit different is that we've had an opportunity to rethink both the product experiences and the user experiences as if we, normal people, were actually the consumers, and something we're very proud of. The second thing that makes Google Fiber a little bit different is the fact that we build to demand. And our go-to-market is something that was very, very new for Google. Fiber is an extremely local process. When people ask us what we do, quite literally, we have thousands and thousands of people running around on streets, digging up roads, and climbing on poles. That's not something that Google historically has been very comfortable with. And you have a lot of problems that that Google historically has never experienced. I spent a big chunk of my time 3 weeks ago now, because we hit a gas line. All right. And when you hit a gas line, it's actually very dangerous. And there are a lot of escalation processes and procedures that you follow, but it's, again, a very different thing. So, anyways, on our go-to-market side of the equation, one of the things we do is we build to demand. And what we do is we ask people, are you interested in getting fiber? Actually, let me take a step back. The first thing we do is we actually take every city that we build and we break them into neighborhoods. We call them fiberhoods, between 300 and 1,000 homes. And then what we tell them is, look, because of the nature of fiber as a relatively fixed cost intensive build, and by the way, we don't say this publicly because it's a pretty complicated concept, but here for this audience, because of its fixed cost nature, we tell you, if you guys get you and X percent of your neighbors to sign up for Google Fiber, we will build fiber into your neighborhoods and connect up everybody. And by the way, when we connect up you and your homes, we'll also connect up your local community centers, your schools, your libraries for free. When we go into the marketplace, we then run these rallies. And the rallies themselves are, really focusing on helping neighbors communicate with their neighbors and friends. These are some pictures of some of our efforts. We have retail stores, which was a little bit of a new thing for Google 4 years ago. It's increasingly more mainstream. We have field teams that are out there in the field, and we engage with the community at a very, very local level. These are pictures of our taco trucks. We run taco trucks, we drive them up and down streets, and in a lot of our areas, a lot of people who don't have broadband today, we spend a lot of time educating them on why they actually need broadband. So we actually do spend quite a bit of time in the communities. We spend a lot of time with our community advocates, and that's a very big part of what we do. We talk to people about the impact of broadband on education, on government, on small businesses, on economic development. We spend a lot of time with our grassroots teams. So that's what Google Fiber is, and that's kind of what we've been doing, really built around those two sources of innovation, product/experience, and then separately on how we take the product into market. Before we moved away from fiber, I actually want to share with you two more fun observations. One observation that's really been surprising to us is how ecosystems move. And I know it sounds relatively obvious, but one very practical example has been that when we first launched in our alpha network at Stanford 3.5 to 4 years ago, I remember that 3 nights before the launch, my PM came to me and was like, we have a big problem. We don't have any routers. And don't ask me why it was 3 days, because it was actually pretty late in the game to figure this out. But the problem that we had was that the RGs in the market that said they were gig capable were nowhere close to gigabit capable. They had all published a set of stats, but when we actually ran the set of tests, we could push a gig from the internet backbone through the neighborhood to the doorstep of your house, but then we couldn't get that gig throughout the house. And what's amazing right now is you'll see on your left-hand panel of the page, I just did a search last night for gigabit router, but if you go into Best Buy, gigabit routers are now the norm. In every Best Buy store that's out there, you go online, it's kind of now the de facto standard, which we think is actually really cool. The other big observation is that for 3.5 years, the incumbents have responded historically with this idea that there is no need for a gig. And I found it curious that a friend passed me this article that Comcast has now trademarked, what is it, True Gig. So it came along with some snarky comments, of course, that, wow, shouldn't they focus on delivering a gig as opposed to just trademarking the name? But the point here is this. Right now, if you look out in the industry, in the US at least, not a week goes by without new sets of announcements. And frankly, at Google Fiber and at Google overall, we're really excited about that. And I think a lot of this conversation, I can talk for hours about it. Some of you in the room might have heard or have followed this recent set of discussions around net neutrality, right? And the importance of a level playing field for content. Our perspective has always been that the net neutrality debate is actually rooted in rationing scarcity. And what do I mean by that? All of the debates are actually rooted in the fact that we don't have enough broadband, right? Hey, how can one user abuse its market position? Or two, now we start talking about what network management protocols look like, when in fact we actually think that the right conversation to be having nationally is really around how do you enable more broadband and more abundance. Because when there is abundance, a lot of these discussions around what gets prioritized over A gets prioritized over B, and et cetera, just go away. So these are some of the two most interesting observations around what we've observed in the market over the last 3 years. And finally, the third thing that I wanted to talk with you guys about was what happens when you can get a critical mass of users in a community that are connected together. This is an article that just came out last week. It was an article in the Tennessean, and it was actually a person had gone back and actually done a bunch of research on what Kansas City looks like. And frankly, from our standpoint, this has been the thing that's been most humbling. And I wanted to share with you a couple of things that we've seen. The first city that we lit was Kansas City. Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. And for those who don't know Kansas City, it's smack dab in the middle of the country between New York and Los Angeles. The city itself is a relatively large metropolitan area, but it's divided into two sides of the state. It's divided into two different states, and there's a lot of legacy there. They were on opposite sides of the Civil War, for example. And so we thought it would be an interesting, we love the city, we love the community, they were really engaged with us, and we also thought that symbolically it'd be amazing to think about building bridges between people and communities, and this would be a great place to get started. Fitch is a debt rating agency. Last year, they upgraded Kansas City, Missouri's debt rating, citing new infrastructure, fiber in this case, but new telecom infrastructure was put in the ground. The state of Missouri, in late 2013 and 2014, first half of 2014, created more technology jobs than the state of California, more than the state of Texas, more than the state of New York. 3, startup formation. The numbers are off the charts because it came from a really low base. But startup formation in Kansas City is off the charts. Capital formation is completely off the charts when you think about venture capital money that is now going into local companies and being reinvested. It's not just new innovation, it's also innovation from existing companies. That's what's actually shocked us the most. There's a company called Hallmark that's based in Kansas City. Don Hall's the CEO, he's the nicest man in the world. They do make greeting cards. Don thinks of his business as building and reinforcing emotional connections between people. They don't think about themselves as a greeting card company. They were one of the first companies that invested in building local labs to start studying the impact of how faster connections, in his view, the fidelity and the instantaneousness that's enabled by faster speeds and what that impact can have on people in their lives. So I thought that was amazing. All the other innovations that we've seen there have really shocked us. I wanted to share with you 3 of my favorite stories, actually. Not at the quantitative level, but more on a qualitative basis. The first was one of our first small businesses in Kansas City that got our service. They were a video editing company, and they used to, with offices in both Chicago and in Kansas City, and quite literally, they would send a person with a storage drive from Kansas City on a plane to Chicago to bring their video files back and forth because it was faster to get it on a plane than it was to upload it online. They don't do that anymore. That's a good thing, I think. Another example is in Provo, one of the other networks that we've lit up recently. There's a geneticist in Provo, and he works with newborn babies in intensive care units. And it used to take him 77 hours to download the human genome. He can now do that in less than half an hour. So just think about that. Something that used to take days now takes less than half an hour, or less than an hour, to do. And that's amazing. And there's another story that I've heard recently that I had a chance to chat with the school. Chattanooga, Tennessee is not a fiber market, which I think is even more awesome. But they have a STEM high school where they're connected to a microscope in the Pacific Ocean where their students can actually study microscopic organisms in the Pacific Ocean as a part of their normal class curriculum. So these are some of the amazing things that we've started to see. And by the way, these are just the tip of the iceberg. I've heard everything from people moving back into Kansas City to, you can go on and on about the list of innovations. We have 9 area hospitals that had actually, for the first time, created a business plan competition. And you have doctors running around thinking about how they're going to use Gigabit applications and what are the new use cases for them. And they have software developers they pulled into this project. So we hear about these stories all the time. And I really think that, and I hope that over the next couple of years, a lot of these stories will become a little bit more mainstream and we can start to observe them. And obviously, I hope that we'll see them spread into other cities as well. Let me just pivot and spend a quick minute on new applications and new innovations. We're really early, but some of the things that we've seen, that we did was, Nick's first pitch was a boy from the Make-A-Wish Foundation who, through a whole series of reasons, can't play baseball anymore. He's a massive baseball fan. We were able to have him throw the first pitch out of a clean room that we actually built in our fiber center in Kansas City, but he was able to throw out the first pitch for an Oakland A's game here in Oakland. He threw it, and there's a whole system of applications and technologies that use a robotic arm here in Oakland A's stadium that actually threw the pitch. We thought that was pretty cool. We've had other examples that we've seen where people were band members in Kansas City from, I want to say the 80s, are actually practicing together online and actually did a concert together online. So we're seeing a lot of early instances of really cool things, really cool ideas start to pop up. But the great thing, and I'm going to quote Vince Cerf, Vince says this a lot. He always says that 99% of the apps are not even built yet. And when you kind of take a big step back, Google Fiber is fundamentally a bet on human creativity. And I know that Patrick, our CFO, gets asked this question a lot, and And every time I say that, Patrick kind of shudders. He's like, oh, how am I going to justify this to our shareholders? It's amazing when a company is willing to make that bet. And the greatest thing about the leadership at Google, and I've heard Eric Schmidt say this over and over, is we believe we're on the right side of history. We're fundamentally convinced that we're going to unleash this next wave of innovation. And that's really the right place to be, is to talk about broadband abundance, rather than broadband scarcity. And so with that, I wanted to just conclude by giving you a quick update on fiber. I mentioned earlier, and I focused a lot of my conversation on fiber in Kansas City, mentioned that we have a network in Provo. We just lit up our first users in Austin late last year. And, you might have followed that over the last year. We've spent a lot of energy out in the broader set of communities with mayors, really with the mayors, but a lot of their state leadership and national leadership as well, but really the mayors are the ones that move the needle on this. A lot of cities out there are trying to figure out what they can do to bring, they call it Google Fiber, but the reality is, how can they encourage new entrants to come in and build new networks and make those types of investments? And we've spent a lot of time evangelizing this. My BD team would be remiss if I didn't plug their efforts here. But for those of you that are active in your communities, I would just like you to remember one thing. There's a lot that you can do. There's a lot that local communities do to impact our ability, anybody's ability, to build new telecom infrastructure. And you'd be surprised. When it comes down to actually implementing our builds, we get stuck on a bunch of things. I'll give you one small story. Permitting. When we went into Kansas City, or for those of you who've submitted local permits, anybody who's tried to do a remodel or build a new house, for God's sake, here in the Bay Area would understand how complicated this is. In Kansas City, we submitted 40,000 permits. We had to get them all approved on time. And I kid you not, when we've had some conversations with cities and we say, hey, is your permitting office actually ready for this volume? It turns out that one major city had 2 people who'd been working there for 45 years. And that's it. That was their permitting office. And we're like, wait, how are we going to get 40,000 permits through this office in 3.5 to 4 months? So there are a lot of things that you can do in your communities to bring fiber there. And then lastly, 2 weeks ago, we announced that we were bringing fiber to 4 new cities, to Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville. This is part of a broader set of announcements that we made earlier last year. We're working with 5 additional metros on top of this. And so hopefully, hopefully we can continue doing our part to raise the discussion in the U.S., raise average broadband speeds in the U.S., and even if we can't bring fiber everywhere, maybe we can hopefully drive the competition to spend a little bit of money upgrading their networks and to make broadband a little bit more affordable for all of us. Okay. Well, that's all I got. With that, I think I have a few more minutes, and I think that I was able to take 2 or 3 questions if there are any from the audience. And then if not, I'm happy to answer questions for people separately.
Yeah, I think we already got one over there.
Sorry. Sorry, the question was to comment maybe on space and to comment on Wi-Fi. I'm hesitating only because it's very hard to find and talk about things that are only public right now. So let me start with the Wi-Fi aspect of it. Wi-Fi is critically important. We're absolutely convinced of that. At Fiber, we spend a lot of time not talking about IP dial tone, but we talk about Wi-Fi dial tone. The reality is that all the devices that people are hooking up to are going to be Wi-Fi connected between here and that access point on the top of the ceilings. Making Wi-Fi work really well is very hard. So that's probably the first thing I would say. Second thing is that Wi-Fi is in its early days. It really is. And I think we spend a lot of energy thinking about spectrum because we do know that the 2.4 bands are actually quite congested. The 5 gigahertz bands have limitations outside of one room. And so we spend a lot of time nationally talking about how do we open up more unlicensed bands. And how do we explore new technologies like dynamic spectrum and spectrum sharing? The technologies have always been there. The regulators and the lawyers, seemingly, no offense to the lawyers in the room, sorry, but the lawyers at the FCC, more specifically, may not be as comfortable with the technologies. So third point on Wi-Fi, I think, is a more philosophical point that maybe I'll raise for some of the folks here in the room. When you think about macro cell technologies or LTE bands, etc., and you think about what the network topology looks like in the limit, like we line up those demand curves, and our belief has always been that, these cells are going to shrink smaller and smaller, and all cells effectively will soon look like, maybe not next year, but X years out, are going to effectively look like your Wi-Fi networks. So we think bringing backhaul deeper into networks or deeper into the field is actually going to be the rate-limiting step for deploying really great mobile coverage. Your question about space is complicated and interesting in different ways. It's super cool. So if you've heard about a lot of the initiatives out there, amazing things are happening. Loon is public. It's not quite space. It's pretty high up there. I think a lot of these initiatives are really geared to a portfolio of problems that are out there. And I alluded to this up front. Google Fiber is very focused on 10% of the population that has good broadband today, but we want to make it better and faster. Maybe 30% depending on which stats you care about, whether you think mobile internet's a trade-off or not. There are 70% of the the worldwide population that don't have connectivity today. A lot of the rural areas where the economics of landline just don't work, right? And so an initiative like Loon is an example of one where you can bring coverage, minimum coverage, if you will, to larger portions of that population. And so that would be my very long-winded answer to your two questions, I think.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other questions? One more question over there. Okay. One more.
When will we get Google Fiber in the Bay Area?
Yeah, it's the question was when do we get Google Fiber in the Bay Area? We did announce that San Jose, that we were working with San Jose. There are a set of cities between Mountain View and San Jose that were part of our earlier announcement. The announcement was only that we're exploring the possibility of bringing fiber to the Bay Area. California is complicated. It's actually very complicated for a variety of reasons. It's not for, and number two, Google is complicated because at almost every other TGIF, we get yelled at by our teams. Why isn't Google Fiber in the areas where a lot of Googlers live, in and around the Bay Area? And frankly, the reality is that all of you, if we really wanted to drive innovation, all of you in the room would be amazing to get on that platform. That's when amazing things really happen. And so I would just go back to the talking points that we've used publicly, is that we're working as hard as we possibly can. It's clearly in our incentive to do that. It's in my personal incentive to do that because I keep getting yelled at by Googlers and Larry. So I'd like this whole thing I'd also like to build out here. But so stay tuned is what I would say.
Okay, one more question.
As compared to Wi-Fi, do you see any future for Wi-Fi?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
Do you see any future for Wi-Fi? W-I-L-I.
I'm sorry, I'm just not familiar enough to really comment on that. And so, maybe I'll find you after this and I can chat with you a little bit more and learn a little bit more about it. Okay.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Can you stay for a few minutes? Stay on stage for a few minutes. Now let's welcome Dr. Chi-Ming Chu, Dr. C.T. Yang, and Dr. David Fang to give the plaque of appreciation to Mr. Lowe. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, again, for the wonderful speech.